My husband surprised me with his mistress at the surprise birthday party I organized for him, but life surprised him with both a literal and figurative blow. For as long as I can remember, my husband has always expressed how meaningful it would be for him to turn 40. His father passed away at 39, so he had one particular wish: to outlive his father. As his 40th birthday approached, I began thinking about how special it would be to organize a surprise party for him. I wanted to plan a celebration where he could be surrounded by the people who loved him most, his family and closest friends. So I gave it my all in the planning. I wanted everything to be perfect, from the guest list to the decorations. I even extended a special invitation to my mother-in-law. She and I have always had a close relationship, and I knew how much it would mean to my husband to have his mom present for this occasion. She lives in another city, so I made sure to book a flight for her to arrive on the day of the party. Everything was coming together, and I couldn't wait to see my husband's face when he walked into a room filled with the people who mattered most to him. On the night of my husband's birthday party, everything was in place. The decorations were perfect. The guests were waiting in silence. The house was dark, and we all kept quiet as we waited for him to arrive. Earlier that day, I had set the stage without giving any hints. During breakfast, I casually mentioned that I would be at my parents' house that night, hoping he wouldn't expect anything special. My goal was to make him think I wasn't planning anything for his birthday. I imagined how surprised he would be when he walked through the door and discovered the surprise waiting for him. When I heard his car pulling into the driveway, my heart started pounding. We all stayed perfectly still. Finally, the door opened. We all jumped in unison, shouting, "Surprise! Happy birthday!" as the lights came on. But instead of the joyful expression I had been expecting, there at the door stood my husband, Jackson, with his tie loosened, his arms around his coworker, April, in the middle of a kiss. Everyone around us fell silent. People didn't know what to do or say, staring at Jackson and April. For some context, my husband and April are co-workers. They've been working together for a while. She's younger than us and is one of his subordinates at the office. Over the years, I've seen her at company holiday parties when Jackson brought me along. I've observed how she interacts with people, especially with him. Sometimes, she would act a bit flirty, and even jokingly refer to herself as his work wife, but I never took it seriously. I let it slide, mainly because she seemed to behave that way with nearly all the older men in the office. I thought it was just part of her personality and never let her behavior bother me because I trusted my husband and didn't see her as a serious threat. But now, seeing them at the door in this situation was a humiliation I never imagined. When my husband realized we were all there, looking at him, he finally stopped. His eyes were unfocused. He looked drunk, swaying a little. He looked around at the people gathered for his surprise party and simply said, "Oops," before bursting into laughter again. Meanwhile, April stood beside him, awkwardly fixing her shirt, her lipstick nearly gone from their kiss. The room was silent, and all I could feel was the crushing weight of embarrassment and pain with everyone's eyes on me, waiting to see how I would react. Cyril, my mother-in-law, was the first to break the silence. She stood up and exclaimed loudly, "Jackson, what the hell are you doing?" Jackson's eyes widened. He hadn't expected to see his mother there, and he slowly turned his head toward her. He tried to explain himself in his dazed state. I didn't expect everyone to be here," he muttered, looking a bit embarrassed now. My heart was pounding as I confronted him directly, asking why he was with April in our house, kissing her, when I had organized this surprise party to celebrate his birthday. I needed to know the answer, even though I was terrified of what he might say. Jackson sighed and shook his head. He looked around before clearing his throat as if he were about to make a trivial announcement. He said he had planned to tell me another time. Then with a smile, he added that since the surprise party had caught him with April, he might as well take the opportunity to reveal the truth. "April and I are together. We've been seeing each other for a few months." He paused, looking at her as if seeking confirmation before looking back at me, "and I'm falling in love with her." I stood there, completely stunned. What was my husband saying? But he didn't stop there, he continued, explaining how he had tried to suppress his feelings for April for months. But this year, he said, he realized he needed to live life on his own terms. "I don't want to end up like my father," he said, with an almost defiant tone. "I need to do what makes me happy before it's too late for me." I stood there, speechless. His words sounded surreal, as if they were coming from someone else, not the man I had built a life with for so many years. He went on with a speech about how his father had died young, never having the chance to fulfill his dreams. "I don't want to end up like him," he said, with an almost defiant tone. "I need to do what makes me happy before it's too late for me." I stood there. My mouth dropped open. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. His words felt like a dagger to my chest. Unable to hold back my anger and betrayal, I grabbed the birthday cake, the very cake I had carefully chosen for him, and without thinking twice, I hurled it straight at his face. The cake splattered all over his clothes, completely ruining them, and some of it even splashed onto April. At first, everyone stood in shock, but then some began to laugh at his expense. Jackson, of course, was furious. While wiping his face, he started yelling at me, "Look at what you've done. You've ruined my shirt." It was almost comical how trivial his complaint was, given the gravity of the situation. There he was, obsessed with the state of his shirt as if that was the most important thing. Not the fact that he had just humiliated me in front of everyone, exposing his betrayal so brazenly. So I told him, "Your shirt was already dirty when that tramp got her lips on you." Without even looking back at me, Jackson stormed off upstairs in anger, probably to change his clothes, while April stayed behind, standing there shamelessly in front of everyone. As soon as Jackson disappeared from sight, I took the opportunity to glare at her with all the hatred I could muster. I then walked over, grabbed her by the hair, and dragged her outside. And believe me, she was screaming, accusing me of mistreating her, but none of the guests moved to help her. No one moved. No one even flinched. She kept screaming furiously as I yelled at her for having the audacity to be with Jackson in my own house at our party in front of our friends. Once we were outside, I spun her around to face me and unleashed the words I had been holding back, like poison on my tongue. "I can't believe it," I spat. "You slept with my husband after all the times you've seen me." But April wasn't the least bit ashamed. She simply smirked, giving me a defiant smile, as if I were the one in the wrong. She replied, "Jackson wanted me. You have no right to get in our way." And she added, "He was going to leave you anyway." She was being arrogant as if everything that was happening was just some kind of game to her. She kept talking, suggesting that instead of blaming her, maybe I should reflect on why I had failed as a wife, implying that my inability to keep him satisfied was the reason he turned to her. Each word pushed me closer to the edge. "You don't understand him like I do," she mocked. "You don't make him smile the way I do. That's why he's leaving you. He deserves someone better than you." I didn't even think. My vision blurred with rage, and the next thing I knew, my hand flew through the air and landed on her face with a sharp smack. No one was going to disrespect me in my own house. April started crying, placing a hand on her cheek where I had slapped her, now red from the impact. Through tears, she yelled a string of insults at me, but it was clear her voice was breaking, as if she was about to start sobbing. Before I could respond, Cyril intervened. "If you don't leave this property right now, you'll get a slap from me too," she threatened. April, still furious, looked at her but didn't dare move toward her. By then, some guests had stepped outside, unwilling to miss what was happening. Some murmured, while others simply stayed silent, not wanting to make things worse. It was a spectacle no one had expected when they arrived. Then, as if on cue, Jackson reappeared. He walked out with a freshly put-on shirt, looking disturbingly calm given the circumstances. He had a bag slung over his shoulder, and it took me a moment to process that he had packed some of his things. When he saw April holding her cheek, tears streaming down her face, he ran to her, wrapping his arm around her protectively as if she were the victim in all of this. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he yelled at me. He looked at me as though I was the one who had crossed the line, as though I had done something unforgivable. In his eyes, I was the villain for slapping the woman who had betrayed me with him. Then he said something I found almost laughable because after everything that had happened, it was obvious. "It's over between us. I can't do this anymore. It's over," he shouted. "I want you out of the house. When I come back from our trip, I don't want to see you here ever again." He had planned a trip with his girlfriend, and now was the moment he chose to confess it to me. I told him he could take his mistress wherever he wanted, and his mother told him he'd also get a slap like the one April had received. Meanwhile, we watched as he took April to the car, and then they both drove off without looking back. I felt an empty, gut-wrenching pain as I watched the taillights disappear down the street. Sora looked just as devastated as I was. Everyone had just witnessed the end of my marriage in real time, and I felt so humiliated. Cyril immediately took control of the situation. She kindly asked everyone to leave, thanking them for coming and apologizing for what had happened. Some people came up to me, giving me awkward hugs and offering a few words of comfort before leaving, while I stood there completely numb, still trying to process what had just happened. When everyone was gone, Cyril guided me to sit down. She handed me a glass of water, and though my hands were trembling, I barely noticed. Once we were alone, I started crying. I had held back for too long. I didn't want to cry in front of everyone, but now that I was alone with her, everything came pouring out. The shock, the humiliation, the absolute disbelief at what had just happened. My husband had destroyed our marriage at his own surprise birthday party, in front of friends and family, while kissing his coworker. And then he had the audacity to kick me out of the house. Sarah hugged me while I cried, saying nothing, just staying by my side, giving me the silent comfort I so desperately needed at that moment. Through my tears, I confessed to Cyril that I felt completely lost. I had no idea what to do, where to go, or how to rebuild my life. I had invested so many years in this marriage, taking care of my husband during his illnesses, cooking, cleaning, even giving up my career because he always wanted a stay-at-home wife. And now he had left me with nothing. I felt lost, both physically and emotionally. I couldn't imagine packing up my life and leaving the home we had shared for so many years. Hearing this, Cyril shook her head firmly and reminded me of something I had apparently forgotten. The house Jackson and I had been living in wasn't really ours. It belonged to Cyril's late husband, a house full of memories she had cherished after his passing. She had generously let us live there so we could start a family and build our life together. "After what my son did to you, I'm ashamed to have raised such a monster," she said. She too felt pain, telling me she realized her own son had become someone she barely recognized. Then, she looked me straight in the eye and said, "This is my house, and I decide who lives here and I choose you." Her words were the best thing to happen to me that night. Or at least, it felt that way after discovering one terrible thing after another. She continued, saying she wouldn't let Jackson and April get away with what they'd done. She wanted to teach Jackson a lesson, to remind him that destroying a marriage and walking away wouldn't come without consequences. Then she added something that made me smile, even in the middle of all the chaos. "There's no way I'm letting April's scrawny, malnourished self move in here with my son. She's not going to ruin my family's home." For my own mother-in-law to defend me like that was something I hadn't expected. I thought she might eventually side with her son, but here she was, looking out for me. Jackson might have thought he could walk out of our marriage and into another woman's arms, but Sarah and I were about to show him that life wouldn't be that easy, which was much easier now that I knew I wouldn't be left homeless. Her support was all I needed to move forward with my plan. So to cut the story short, over the weekend, I signed a rental agreement with her, making everything official. I wanted proof, something concrete to ensure Jackson couldn't kick me out. With the contract in place, I knew I had a solid foundation to stand on. That same weekend, I carefully packed up all of Jackson's belongings. It was strangely therapeutic to box up the remnants of the life we had shared. I neatly stacked them on the porch, where he could easily pick them up when he returned from his trip. Although I didn't really care if it rained and ruined everything, I think I'd seen that in my weather app. It wasn't until a week later that I finally saw his car pulling into the driveway. By then, I had made all the necessary preparations. I had installed security cameras outside the house because I knew what was coming. I needed the cameras for my own protection in case things got messy. I had also changed the locks. There was no way he was getting into my house. As expected, when he tried to put his key into the door, nothing happened. It was just like that night when he showed up drunk for his birthday. He struggled with the lock for a moment before realizing it wouldn't open. His face twisted in frustration, something I saw later on the camera, and soon he started banging on the door. "Open the door," he shouted, growing more frustrated by the second. I watched him through the camera feeling oddly calm. I had no intention of letting him in, not after everything that had happened. So instead of opening the door, I spoke to him through the intercom, keeping my voice as casual as I could. "What are you doing here, Jackson?" I asked with a serene tone. It didn't take him long to respond. He started yelling, accusing me of staying too long, insisting that he had given me enough time to pack my things and that I should have been gone by now. He ranted about how tired he was of me, how he couldn't stand my supposed neediness and desperation to stay here when he had already ended our marriage in front of everyone. He said he didn't want to deal with me, that he just wanted a divorce and for me to disappear from his life. Then his eyes fell on the boxes outside, which by then were a pile of soggy rain-soaked boxes. He went silent. I guess he hadn't noticed before that those were his things outside. He looked at the boxes and then back at the door, shaking his head like this was some kind of ridiculous joke. But it wasn't, and he knew it. "Do you think you can throw my stuff out like this? Do you think you'll get away with it?" He stepped closer to the door, banging on it even harder. "You have no right to do this. I'll take you to court if I have to," he shouted, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "Do you hear me? I'll sue you for this. You can't just kick me out of my own house, and we'll sue you too for hitting April." I let him rant, watching him pace angrily on the porch through the camera. It was almost amusing how he still thought he had control of the situation. I approached the intercom, my voice cold and calm, and explained to him that this wasn't his house. It was his mother's. I told him I had signed a lease agreement with Cyril, making the house legally mine to live in now, and pointed out that he was the one trespassing. After a brief pause to give him time to process my words, I continued, telling him that if he wanted to take this matter to court, he was free to try, but I doubted he had much of a case. I demanded that he take his things and leave immediately or I would call the police. I watched him through the camera. He almost looked pitiful really, the way he stood there frozen for a moment. But then, as quickly as confusion appeared, it was replaced with fury. He shouted at the door and, suddenly, with an angry motion, pulled out his phone. I had no doubt he was calling his mother, probably hoping she would come to his rescue and undo the situation, but I knew she had no intention of doing that. I was certain she'd tell him exactly what I had, that this was no longer his home, and he needed to accept the consequences of his actions. As I watched him storm around the porch in anger, kicking boxes and muttering under his breath, it became clear that his conversation wasn't going in his favor. His frustration boiled over as he stomped around kicking one of the boxes I had so carefully and lovingly packed for him, which, unfortunately, had been ruined. But all that did was scatter his belongings across the porch. I could hear him yelling profanities at the door, calling me a thief and accusing me of stealing his house. "I'll make you pay for this," he kept repeating. I could have responded to his insults, but I didn't see the point. I knew he couldn't do anything. Not really. He could try to take this to court if he wanted, but we both knew he didn't have a leg to stand on. I had done everything legally, and there was no way he could claim I'd wronged him when he was the one who had broken our marriage vows, betraying me in the worst possible way. And as for April, I doubt many of our friends and family would want to testify on her behalf. After what felt like an hour of watching him rage outside, he finally ran out of steam. He looked defeated. His shoulders slumped as he realized there was no way he could win this. With no other choice, Jackson finally began moving his boxes to the car. I watched as he loaded the last of his things into the trunk, slammed it shut, and drove off. Since that day, I've received multiple voicemails from both Jackson and April until I finally got tired of it and blocked them. Still, the ones I did receive were each more bitter than the last. April, in particular, seems to enjoy calling me a witch for successfully kicking Jackson out of the house. She keeps talking about how the two of them wanted to start fresh in this home and that I stole that dream from them. Apparently, Jackson has been living in a motel, and according to his messages, he's miserable. So that's my divorce story for this subreddit. I've read other stories here too and thought this might fit well with the theme of the place. Update 1. I wanted to clarify a few things I forgot to mention in my original post. The reason Jackson isn't living with April right now is that she shares her place with 2 roommates, and her landlord is very strict about the rules. Apparently, they're not allowed to have Jackson move in, which I find pretty ironic. If they're so committed to each other, then I think April should break her lease and find a place where the two of them can play house. But, honestly, they can do whatever they want. It's no longer my problem. My focus now is on ensuring Jackson pays for what he's done in more ways than one. I've already filed for divorce and am prepared to fight tooth and nail to make sure he pays a substantial amount in spousal support. Maybe he thought he could walk away from this marriage without consequences, but he's about to learn that actions have repercussions, especially when you betray someone who was nothing but loyal to you. He wants a life with April? That's fine, but he's going to help me rebuild the life he destroyed, whether he likes it or not. Update 2. It's been 2 months since my last update. I took all your suggestions into account and finally sent an email to Jackson's company about his ongoing affair with April. I knew airing our dirty laundry wouldn't change the betrayal he inflicted on me, but I felt it was necessary for the sake of his other subordinates. In my email, I detailed everything Jackson had confessed about their relationship. Exposing the fact that it had been going on for months, I recounted specific incidents I had witnessed, including April's inappropriate behavior with older men at various office parties. I wanted to make it clear that their relationship wasn't just a personal betrayal, but also an ongoing violation of workplace ethics. To my surprise, after a week of silence, some of Jackson's co-workers, who had also become my friends over the years, told me that HR had launched a full investigation into the matter. I didn't expect the company to take my email seriously, but, apparently, word had gotten out about the favoritism Jackson had shown to April over other employees. He had been giving her preferential treatment for a long time, which had always caused suspicion and murmurs of discontent in the office. So, the combination of my detailed account and complaints from other employees forced the company to investigate. Jackson's affair stopped being a private matter. It had crossed into the professional realm, and that changed everything. A few days later, I learned from my friends that Jackson had been fired as a result of the investigation. As for April, I'm not sure if she'll face the same fate. My friends tell me HR is still investigating her role in the situation, but I haven't heard anything definitive. Part of me hopes she faces consequences too, though I know that, in the end, that's no longer in my hands. For those worried about my alimony situation and whether I'll still be entitled to anything now that Jackson has been fired, don't worry. I'm in a good position. Over the years, Jackson earned a substantial income, and I've come to realize he rarely spent it on us. We never went on vacations, had very few date nights, and he rarely bought me anything. Looking back, the signs were always there, but I didn't want to see them. Anyway, my only focus now is finalizing the divorce. I'm committed to ensuring I get what I deserve. I've been through too much to settle for less than what's fair. With Jackson's job loss and everything else that's happened, I feel like I'm on the verge of a new beginning. I'm ready to move forward. Update 3.